first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the fuse box cover and we're going to take out the fuel pump fuse. Get inside the vehicle, crank it until it dies on its own. Then you'll know the fuel pressure is released from the vehicle. After that is done, we're going to disconnect the battery so that we can remove our PCM. Now that the battery terminal is removed, we're going to cover it so that we don't have any arcing. The next step is to remove the PCM. Now if you have a shop or a tuner that can unlock the PCM for you, you can avoid this step. But if you are installing this at home, you're going to remove the PCM, have it sent out to be unlocked, and then your vehicle can be tuned. There will be 3 bolts that hold the PCM in and the 2 connectors. Slide the PCM up and out of the way and set it aside for now. Now we're going to remove some covers. First we're going to take the engine cover out of the way, and then we're going to move on to the radiator shroud. The radiator shroud will have some push clips in it. Go ahead and pry those out gently and then we can remove the shroud. Now that the radiator shroud is out of the way, we're going to remove our front grille. You're going to find a couple of push clips on either side and in the center. Remove those and set those aside. Once all the push clips are out of the way, you're going to gently pry on the grille. It has a couple of push pins that are on the bottom of the grille. So gently pry, and then you can remove the grille out of the way after you unplug the fog lights. There's going to be a pigtail on each side. You're going to release the lock, and then you can release the clip and remove the connector. Now that the shrouds are out of the way, we're going to remove our cold air intake. You can release the 4 clips that hold the lid of the intake together, and then you'll remove the upper half of the intake. There's going to be 1 breather hose, 1 clamp on the throttle body, and then you'll have an intake air temperature sensor that you need to unplug as well. Now we can remove the lower portion of the intake. Go ahead and remove the filter, and then gently tug on the box to release it from its clips. Now we can release the tension on our belt and remove the alternator. You're going to use a 1/2-inch drive breaker bar, release the tension, slide the belt off of the pulley and out of the way. The next thing we're going to disconnect is the 13mm nut that holds the power wire onto the alternator. Once that's out of the way, you can disconnect the pigtail for the alternator, and then we're ready to unbolt it. There's going to be 6 bolts that you remove, 4 on the upper side of the alternator, and then 2 on the alternator bracket itself. And now we can remove the alternator. Now we can remove the throttle body. The first step will be to disconnect the pigtail. Once the pigtail is out of the way, we're going to release the clips holding the wire harness in place. Then we can remove the bolts. There will be 4 10mm bolts. Now we can take the throttle body out of the way. Our next step is going to be to remove the alternator bracket. There will be 2 bolts holding this on. Now we can take the serpentine belt out of the way. The next thing we're going to do is remove some of the Evap lines. We're going to set these aside as we will reuse them later. There's a push clip to release it. And the line routes over the top of the valve cover and under the heater tubes. Now we're going to take the breather line and the transmission vent tube off of the side of the intake manifold. We're going to loosen the stiffener brackets that hold the intake manifold to the lower manifold. There's going to be 2 10mm nuts. We're going to remove these and lift the bracket with the upper intake manifold. Now we can remove the vacuum line from the driver's side of the manifold. We're going to remove the clip in the back, and then we can take the bolts out of the stiffener bracket on the rear of the manifold. These will also be 10mm. The next thing we're going to remove is the bracket that holds the electrical connector and the heater tubes on the passenger side of the vehicle. There's going to be 6 total bolts, 2 on the top of the manifold, 2 in the center of the bracket, and 2 on the bottom side of the valve cover. The next thing we're going to remove is the bracket that holds the electrical connector and the heater tubes on the passenger side of the vehicle. There's going to be 6 total bolts, 2 on the top of the manifold, 2 in the center of the bracket, and 2 on the bottom side of the valve cover. The next thing we can remove is the foam insulator on the back of the intake manifold. This is going to have two push clips. Release the clips and then you can slide the insulator out of the way. Once the bracket is out of the way, we can now remove the bolts that hold the intake manifold down. These are going to be 8mm bolts. Once all the bolts are loose, you can remove the upper intake manifold from the vehicle. You're going to save the throttle body O-ring. We will reuse this on the Supercharger kit. You can remove the foam insulator from the driver's side valve cover. And now we're going to unplug the injectors. Each injector has a lock. You will release the lock and then you can squeeze the connector to release it from the injector. After all 6 injectors are unplugged, you can release the fuel feed line. You're going to release the lock and then squeeze the clip. Gently pull back and it will release. Once all of that is done, you can unbolt the lower intake manifold. These are going to be 8mm bolts. Once your bolts are loose, your injectors are unplugged, and your fuel rail is disconnected, you can remove the lower intake manifold from the vehicle. You want to make sure on the back of the lower intake manifold that the wiring harness is not attached anywhere. Once the manifold is out of the way, you're going to take some masking tape and you're going to cover up the intake ports so that we don't drop any debris into our engine. The next thing we're going to do is remove the coolant from the system so that we can remove the heater hoses and the heater pipes. On the passenger side of the engine, there will be a drain for the radiator. You're going to remove the drain and make sure you have a drain pan handy to catch the coolant that comes out. After you've drained the coolant, we're going to remove the heater hose assemblies. Now we can remove the heater hose assemblies from the firewall. The last hose is going to go down into the valley of the block to the oil cooler. You're going to remove that from the heater pipe assembly as well. Once all your clamps are loose, you can release the hoses and remove the whole assembly from the vehicle. Now on the lower intake manifold, you're going to take the intake gaskets. We will reuse these and the supplied lower manifold with the kit. Make sure that they're still nice and pliable. If you have any concerns with the quality of the gasket, you will replace them with OEM gaskets. Now we're going to remove the fuel rails from our OEM manifold, and we're going to transfer that over to the supplied manifold. Now we can remove the fuel rail from our manifold assembly. We're going to put it on some pig mats because there will be some excess fuel left over in the rails. You don't want to make too big of a mess. Next thing we're going to do is take some of our supplied super lube. We're going to lube the O-rings for our new fuel injectors. Get them ready for installation. You're going to want to apply lube to both O-rings on the injector. Now we can slide them into the fuel rail. And once all 6 are installed, we can move on to installation on the manifold. The fuel rail will only go on one way on the manifold, so if you're having difficulty installing it, flip it around and you will be good to go. Gently press the fuel rail into place and then bolt the fuel rail down. Now we can remove the masking tape from our intake manifold ports and we can install our lower intake manifold. Make sure that all of your gaskets are properly seated in the manifold before you install. Slide it into place, and then you're ready to bolt it down. Now that the manifold is bolted down, we can plug in our injectors and reinstall our fuel feed line. Make sure when you plug the injectors in that they are seated all the way so that you can engage the locks. They will be very hard to get to after the supercharger is installed. The next thing we're going to do is prepare our upper manifold for installation on the vehicle. We're going to remove the intercooler from the assembly so that we can get to the bolts to bolt it down to the lower manifold. You're going to remove all the bolts that you see on the top, and then you're going to remove the water outlet on the front so that the transfer tubes can be removed so that the intercooler can come out of the upper manifold assembly. Now we're going to remove the bracket that held the heater tubes out of the way. We're going to take this out of the car. It's not needed with our new heater hoses. We're going to take the supplied Evap lines. We're going to hook those up to the back of the valve covers. We're going to route those out of the way for the time being, and then we can move on to our heater hoses. You're going to take the supplied heater hoses, route them first to the heater core. Once you get those in place and get your clamps connected, you're going to make sure that the hose from the oil cooler is also connected, and then you'll connect those to the front of the engine. And then we can move on to installation of the upper manifold. Now we can take our upper manifold and place it onto our lower manifold. You're going to want to make sure that you move the wiring harness out of the way and that nothing is pinched when you place this down. We're going to start a few bolts on the outside. When you put the bolts on the inside, you want to be very careful that you do not drop them into the intake manifold. Once everything is in place, you can torque the bolts down and we can reinstall our intercooler core. Now we can reinstall the intercooler core in the reverse order that we uninstalled it. You're going to slide it in place, install all the bolts that you removed from the top, and then you can reinstall the transfer tubes. Those are very important that they make it back in, and then you can install your water outlet. We are going to install a little bit of the supplied Loctite onto the bolts. That way the intercooler does not rattle loose under boost and ingest a bolt. Now we can install the supplied map sensor with the kit. And we're going to install the IAT sensor that we removed from our factory cold air intake. The tab on the IAT sensor will rest in the machined boss, and then you will install the bolt to hold it into place. Once all the bolts are tight, we're going to install the supplied jumper harnesses. We're going to set these to the passenger side We will reroute them and plug them in once the supercharger is in place. Now we're going to install our heat exchanger. We're going to slide the brackets over the radiator support, lift the harness out of the way, slide it into place. Then you can use the supplied bolts to bolt it down. Next, we're going to install the supplied mounting bracket to the side of the supercharger, and we can set it into place. You're going to lift it into the car. You're going to rest it on the two bosses on the upper manifold. Now that the two main bolts are in place, we're going to go to the back of the driver's side of the blower, and we're going to install two bolts into the support bracket. Once the rear bracket is in place, we can go ahead and reinstall our front support bracket. Our oil cap extension is going to be removed. We're just going to install the cap directly into the valve cover. The next thing we're going to do is install the O-ring and the block-off plate on this part of the inlet. Now we can reinstall our throttle body O-ring, and then we can put our throttle body onto the supercharger. Make sure you plug your throttle body in. Now we can install the lid. You're going to take the supplied RTV sealant, you're going to follow the pattern listed in the instructions supplied with your supercharger kit. Once the RTV is in place, you can install the lid, start your bolts, and then torque them in the sequence also shown in the supplied instructions. Next, we're going to install the bracket that holds our idler pulleys for our new supercharger belt drive. You're going to apply a wrench to the back of the bracket, and then you can tighten the bolt on the front. Now we can install our idler pulleys. We're going to use a little bit of the supplied Loctite to make sure that the pulleys do not come loose. We're going to apply a little bit of Loctite and install the supplied set screw. You're not going to torque this down super hard, but you are going to spin it in until it makes contact, and then you are good. Now we can install the supercharger pulley. You're going to apply a little bit of Loctite to these bolts as well. Now we can install the supercharger pulley. You're going to apply a little bit of Loctite to these bolts as well. Now we're going to take the jumper harnesses that we put aside earlier. We're going to route those behind our idler bracket and under the supercharger inlet. And then we're going to connect those to the factory locations for your map sensor and your intake air temperature sensor. Now we can reinstall our factory Evap lines. We're going to route them under our heater hoses, plug it back in next to the fuse box, and then we can route it under the supercharger inlet and to the driver's side. Once you're on the driver's side, you can plug your hose into the supplied elbow from the supercharger inlet. Once that's in place, you can take the brake booster vacuum line and also attach that to your supercharger inlet. Now we can move on to our breather hoses. You're going to plug in on this side of the inlet, and then we can move on to our serpentine belt. We're going to put the belt in place for now, and then we can reinstall our alternator, and then we can move on to final assembly of the belt system. Now with the alternator, we'll start by reinstalling the factory bracket. Once the factory bracket is in place, we can put the alternator back in place. Make sure that the belt is routed correctly around all the pulleys before you put it into its final position. Reinstall the 4 bolts that you took out, and then you can put the tension back on the belt. Now that the bolts are tight, we're going to reconnect our power wire. This is going to be a 13mm nut. Then we can plug our alternator in. And now we can install the belt. Now that the belt is installed, we're going to route our hoses for the heat exchanger system. We're going to start by routing our feed line to the intercooler pump behind the supercharger so we can connect it to the reservoir. Once you have it pulled out of the other side, you're going to go ahead and install your clamp. Then you can put the reservoir in place, finalize your clamp, and then you can mount your reservoir on the supercharger lid. There will be 3 10mm bolts that hold the reservoir in place. Now that the reservoir is mounted, we're going to install our upper hose to the intercooler from the reservoir. Once you get it in place, make sure you install both of your clamps. And now we can move on to the lower hose. You're going to take this end of the hose, attach it to the intercooler, and we're going to route this through the front grille and attach it to our heat exchanger. Once your clamp is in place, you can reposition your heat exchanger. Now we're going to install our intercooler bracket. This bracket is going to mount to the radiator support underneath the vehicle. You're going to find the best spot for your setup. Wrap it around the main support and then tighten the 2 bolts once the intercooler pump is in place. You're going to want to make sure your intercooler pump inlet and outlet are facing where you want before you tighten the bolts. Now we can connect our hose to the outlet of the intercooler. This is going to go from the intercooler pump to the heat exchanger, And then we can attach our feed hose, which is the hose that we ran first behind the back of the blower. Once that's tight, we're going to take our fuse, we're going to attach it to the harness, and we're going to plug it in to the supplied location from your instruction manual. You're going to route the wire in a way that it does not pinch when you reinstall the fuse box lid. Next, we're going to install the ground. We're going to use the factory ground on the side of the fender. You're going to want to make sure that when you attach the ground, you go on top of, not under the factory ground. Reinstall the nut, and then you can move on to harness routing. Once your harness is routed, you can plug in your intercooler pump and move on to the intake. Now we can reinstall our lower intake. You're going to press it into the factory grommets. Make sure it's seated, and then we can install the upper portion of the intake. You're going to install the supplied air tube to the factory upper box for the intake. Set that in place. Make sure all your clamps are tight, and then make sure the clamp on the throttle body is tight as well. Once all your clamps are tight, you're going to connect your factory PCV connection to the tube, and then we can move on to plugging in our intercooler pump. Now we can reinstall our fuel pump fuse, reinstall our fuse box cover, and then we can reconnect our battery. Now we can fill our radiator with coolant, and then we can move on to our heat exchanger system and fill that as well. You want to make sure that there are no air bubbles so that you do not overheat and that your intercooler system has good flow. We're going to use 2 different color coolants so that way if there is a leak in the future we can differentiate the systems easily. Now we can reinstall our front grille and our radiator shroud. Make sure you get the push clips on the bottom in place and make sure you plug in your fog lights on either side. Once those are plugged in, line up your push clips, put the grille in place, and then reinstall all of the upper push clips. Now that the grille is in place, we can install our upper radiator shroud. We're going to get that in place, reinstall the push clips, and then we are finished with our install.